really exciting to be here. I'm very grateful to be able to share my work with you guys today. And thank you for sticking with me into this next hour without a break. Hopefully this will be entertaining enough to warrant not going to the bathroom. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you about how consumers perceive time and how that affects their preferences. This is joint work with my colleague Ed O'Brien at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. All right, so products and brands and experiences are so often advertised by highlighting their novelty. The word new gets thrown around a lot in advertising, whether it's new sandwiches, computers, cars, new looks, new formulas, branding, homes, flavors, and so on. Now, novelty is extremely appealing, and I'm not here to dispute that by any means, but it's also not the only way, not the only selling point, right? The appeal of novelty is fleeting, right? And a lot of what makes for repeat consumption relies on the things that are familiar about our products and brands. And so that begs the question of when is familiarity most attractive and why? And today I'd like to propose one fairly common context that consumers experience on a daily basis when familiarity becomes especially attractive. All right, so to illustrate, I'd like to present a thought experiment. So imagine you are making dinner plans for tonight, and you're choosing between two restaurants. You've got restaurant A and restaurant B, and by all accounts, they are very similar on all of the basic features like price and distance and access and so on. But the key difference is that one is novel and one is familiar. Okay, so you can think of the familiar option as something like an old favorite. This is a go-to spot that you've been many times and you know you love going there. You can think of the novel option, the novel restaurant, as maybe an exciting new place that's been on your bucket list. This is a place that you haven't been to yet, but that you find very exciting and attractive. Okay, so you can sort of think to yourself, given these two options that are very similar on all of the basic features, but one is familiar and one is new, which one might you choose for dinner? All right, now, if you're like most people, you may find the novel option to be especially attractive because novel things are exciting and stimulating. And familiar things are by definition the things that have become predictable and can become boring. So new things get this sort of hedonic boost of being new. Now, I'd like you to imagine the same scenario, but with one small difference, and that's that you're choosing for your last chance to go out to a restaurant for a while. So you can imagine maybe this is a particularly busy time at work coming up, and you're expecting to not be able to go out to restaurants that much. Or maybe you're about to start a diet and you're trying to cook at home more often. But for whatever reason, this next restaurant opportunity is your kind of last hurrah. And so now, given these two options, the question is, does that last opportunity issue change your choice? All right, now, in this ending kind of context, there's a popular notion of the bucket list, right? This idea that as people face endings, new things can be especially attractive. In the context of how we use that phrase colloquially, it's this idea that as you're facing the end of life, all of a sudden you are interested in going skydiving, or in the case of this movie, motorcycling on the Great Wall of China. Now, that same logic scales down to, if this is your last opportunity to do something that's even more low stakes, you may still be more attracted to doing something new and exciting, essentially because it puts an exclamation mark on that experience. You want to go out with a bang. And what I'll show you is that that's actually not what people do. When people are facing endings, they're more interested in doing familiar things. Now, you might consider, well, of course, people do familiar things because they're more reliably enjoyable. And that would be reasonable. But actually what I'll show you is that the main reason that people choose familiar experiences like this in ending context is because they're more meaningful. So the familiar experiences are the ones that tend to be more connected to people's life stories, things that people consider to be meaningful, that matter to them personally, or that help them make sense of the world. And so that is what makes familiar experiences most attractive in ending contexts. All right, so endings make familiar things more attractive because familiar things tend to be more meaningful. Now, how useful is this information to you depends in part on how able you are to pull the levers on each of these different pieces. How familiar are we talking? How meaningful? How much does it feel like an ending? And so I will show you some evidence for these pieces, but first I want to unpack a little bit what I mean by endings. So like the bucket list example, when I mention endings, people tend to think of these really big, dramatic, major, permanent endings. But in fact, consumers are experiencing endings constantly in their everyday lives. You can think about how, as consumers go about their daily lives, they're having consumer experiences. They're constantly either starting or are in the middle or are finishing experiences, right? So there are lots of endings that are happening, and they come in all shapes and sizes. Whether that means that they are naturally occurring, like with the changing of the seasons, or they can be self-imposed and chosen, like when you're leaving a party. They can be planned, like with the cool down of an exercise class. They can be unexpected, like with a walk-off home run. Endings can also be temporary. They don't have to be permanent necessarily. So you may recall, the global pandemic that happened not too long ago, where all of the restaurants were shut down. And you may remember the sort of weeks leading up to those restaurant shutdowns. You knew they were going to shut down. You knew that they would reopen again someday, but it still probably felt like an ending nonetheless, a last chance. So as consumers are going throughout their lives, they're having these consumer experiences that are all strung together and overlaid on top of each other, which means that they're experiencing lots and lots of ending moments. And this is important to recognize because those ending moments are ones in which we would be able to target customers. So in these moments, they're still making these decisions between new and familiar brands, products, experiences. That is to say that when summer is almost over, it seems that people are more likely to go to their go-to outdoor restaurant. If they're starting their diet tomorrow, they're more likely to choose their classic go-to desserts. If it's the last day of a trip, they're more likely to return to familiar cafes and bars. Right? And so again, this isn't just because those things are more reliably enjoyable. It's because people have forged some kind of personal connection to those things. And that's what makes them attractive in those ending moments. All right, so I'd like to show you some evidence for this. I'll show you in studies 1 and 2 that endings do indeed motivate repeat consumption.
Can I ask a clarification? Mm-hmm. Do you think every kind of ending should have the same stuff? Like I was thinking, like some of the familiar sounds like the right thing. Like I was thinking early on, and you were motivating the other. No, I would like familiar, but there are places where I think it may not be. Like for example, last day of a trip, I might be a little more motivated to think, oh, meaning I'm in a different place. I want to try something totally new. Or do you think that this is common across all of those places?
Right. So a lot of this is subjective, right? So if your trip is 2 days, you may want to extract as much novelty as possible out of it. But if you were to say move away from your hometown,
so I'm spending a year there and then coming back.
Sure, and the line between those can be blurry, but overall, to the extent that people feel like they're experiencing an ending, which you might not feel as much with a short trip, meaning becomes a big factor. Okay, so endings motivate repeat consumption. Let me show you some evidence. In one study, we give people 10 hypothetical choices between a new option and a familiar option in 10 different types of experiences, ranging from restaurants to social partners, cities to visit, live music, books, and so on. So in each one of these, we ask people, which do you prefer, a new version of this thing, like a new restaurant, or a familiar version, familiar restaurant, right? Holding all of these basic features constant, like price and distance and so on. All right, so we give people these choices, and we also manipulate whether they are facing an ending context or not. So in the control condition, it's exactly as I just described. But in the ending condition, we just give them this other little piece of information, which is, by the way, this is your last chance to do that thing for a while, now make your choice. So does that affect what people want? So on this graph, higher bars here are the percent of people that chose the familiar option instead of the novel one. The orange bars that I'll show you are the ending participants, the ending condition, and the blue bars are the control. And so in each one of these domains, you see that endings made people really want familiar things. All right, so this is some initial evidence that endings seem to motivate repeat consumption, but I imposed this ending on people, and it's vague, right? Just imagine this is your last time to do something, right? But what about more naturalistic endings that people are more used to having? So for example, New Year's resolutions. A few days before New Year's, we asked people to tell us what their resolutions were, specifically the kinds of resolutions where you're giving something up, like sweets, smoking, Instagram, that kind of thing. Now, we had people choose between a novel or familiar option that was essentially a measure of how interested are you in thinking about a novel or familiar version of that thing you're giving up, Instagram or sweets or so on. All right, so it's a measure of interest, and we asked them these 3 different time points. One was during an ending context, and the other 2 were in these control contexts. So it looked like this. So you have New Year's, which is this big looming ending. People are about to give up something, right? And we ask them either before New Year's or after New Year's. So the ending is either looming or it's long in the past. So at one point, the choice is just before, and the other 2 was a month later, 3 months later. All right. Now, again, higher bars mean people were interested in familiar things. So when people were when it was right before New Year's, 70% chose the familiar option. But afterwards, their interest in the familiar thing waned quite a bit, right? So, and this ended up being completely separate from whether they were sticking with their resolution or not. All right, so this is further evidence that endings do seem to motivate repeat consumption. So, those are the endings that people encounter sort of in their daily lives, but it would be much easier to manufacture endings, right? So can you do that? The answer is yes, and it's not too hard. So we brought people in and we entered them into a raffle for a $30 gift card to a restaurant of their choice. And it would either be a restaurant that they were familiar with and loved going to, or a restaurant that they had never been to before but were excited to go to. And they got to choose which kind of restaurant they wanted. Now, importantly, this gift card would expire in a month. All right, and then we manipulated the control versus ending manipulation context with a brief thought exercise. So in the control condition, we just had them think about how over the next month they'd have plenty of opportunities to go out to restaurants. The idea being that whenever they use this gift card would just be one of many opportunities. There's no looming ending. But in the ending context, we just had them think briefly about how few opportunities they would have to eat out in restaurants, right? How rare those opportunities, think about all the things that would prevent them from going to restaurants in the next month. The implication being that when they use the gift card, might be their last chance to do that for a while. All right, now does that push around people's preferences for novelty or familiarity? Well, in the control condition, people chose the familiar thing about half the time, and after this brief thinking exercise, that jumped up to 70%. So when people just felt busier, all of a sudden they were much more interested in the familiar thing. All right, so I told you that this was driven by meaning, so let me try and show you some evidence for that. So we had people find a new a song that they were excited to listen to but hadn't listened to yet, or a familiar song that they had heard many times and were excited to listen to again. So they find these two songs and they would choose which song to listen to in our study. Now we also had them measure how important is pleasure versus meaning when they made this choice, right? Now to manipulate endings, what we did here is we first had people commit to participating in a self-control study where after the study, if they're chosen, they would have to give up listening to music for a full week starting immediately after the study, right? And then we actually randomly assigned people to follow through or not. So in the control condition, we said, never mind. Actually, just listen to music as normal. No ending, no looming ending. But in the ending context, we said, yes, indeed, you have been chosen for this study, and you are expected to not listen to music for a full week starting immediately after the study. We will be following up with you to make sure that you are adhering to this. Okay? And so first of all, we found that did motivate people to want meaning more, and they also pushed people into choosing the familiar thing more often. And we showed that statistically, the increased desire for meaning is the thing that explains the increased desire for the familiar experience. All right, so hopefully I've illustrated that endings do motivate repeat consumption and that this seems to be driven by a desire for meaning. Now, what do you do with that information? Well, first of all, this should open up new opportunities to use familiarity as a marketing tactic beyond just highlighting novelty. And one way to do that is by identifying these sort of existing endings that consumers are encountering in their everyday lives. So one way to think about this would be, for example, if you wanted to send out resubscription appeals, you might target people just before their birthday, and when you do so, instead of highlighting the things that make your product or brand novel, you highlight the things that make them familiar or meaningful, the things that connect people to your brand or product. And to the extent that you are unable to locate people or target people during these ending moments, you can also manufacture these ending moments rather easily by just having people do this short thought experiment that we did. By making people feel like they were busier than usual, all of a sudden this pushed things around. So you can imagine doing the same thing from a marketing standpoint, having your marketing campaigns just push people to feel a little busier than normal, making them feel like they are facing an ending, and using this to do things like increase customer loyalty, reactivating lapsed customers, encouraging repeat consumption, and so on. And then lastly, this whole process operates on meaning, right? And so to the extent that you are unable to leverage your brand or product's familiarity, you can rely on the sense of meaning, right? And so you can imagine that during ending moments, you might connect your brand or product to people's sense of life narrative or the values that they hold most dear. All right. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.